I have to say, you are the best dressed guest I have ever had.
Well, it's the summer. We're in Jerusalem. It's blistering hot. And I know you're a chill guy and it's a chill show. So we decided to go with my South of France outfit.
I love it. You look like you're ready to go party on a yacht. If we could make your Twitter into a Netflix series, people would binge it. We need to have somebody at one point do drunken tweets where they read your tweets but in a drunk voice, because that would be one of the most entertaining shows on Comedy Central, maybe since the Chappelle Show. Hillel, we're talking about Twitter and you're not even drinking. Like, you gotta drink a little bit more. I gotta stop you.
All right.
L'chaim. Hi, welcome to Wine with Adam. I'm your host, Adam Scott Bellos, and today we come to you live from the Tikva Fund building in Jerusalem, and I am joined by my very special guest and good friend, Hillel Neuer. And today we are going to be talking about the United Nations and human rights and the Human Rights Council. But first, we are going to taste some wine. Today, we are going to be tasting one of my favorite wines of all time in Israel. It's the Bravdo Merlot. It's made from Bravdo Winery, or Yekev Karmi Yosef. It's one of the few estate wineries in Israel. They've been making wine for about 15 years. They make under 100,000 bottles. We're just gonna give it a taste and a sniff. And I wanna hear what you think, because you're Mr. International. And I know in the circles that you are in, like, there's a lot of wine tasting. Am I right?
There can be.
There can be.
There can be.
There can be. L'chaim to you. Oh, wow.
Excellent.
So I'm here with Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of the UN Watch, international lawyer, human rights activist. So my first question for you is, what was the main thing that put you on the trajectory of becoming a human rights lawyer? Because you did a bunch of stuff prior to joining UN Watch. You fought the New York State prison system. You had a First Amendment case for prisoners' rights and freedom of religion. You challenged the US Air Force at one point to advocate for African Americans, claiming that there was a pattern of racial discrimination and hiring promotions. How does a kid from Montreal end up, becoming a human rights activist?
Yeah, well, I studied political science and eventually went on to study law. And certainly by the time I was in law school, I already developed an interest in human rights. And you mentioned Professor Erwin Kotler, so he was my mentor in law school.
So you studied with Professor Kotler.
Professor Kotler is one of the great human rights lawyers of our time.
So the first thing that I kind of, everybody knows you as this angry guy that's arguing at the UN, and you're not really this angry guy.
At the UN, I'm serious, but my nature is actually, I like to be funny, and I have a sense of humor.
You have a very good sense of humor. I don't think people know that about you.
I try to use it on Twitter because things are so absurd and so extreme. I find that can be a useful method and weapon to expose hypocrisy.
I want to talk to you about something that's very important in terms of understanding the context of where we are with the UN. That goes back about 30 years. I'd like to have you explain to me what the Soviet era voting bloc was and how that has led to the reality that we have today with Israel being the picked on, bullied kid in the UN.
It's an important question that you're asking. It's one of the most significant developments at the United Nations, I would say, starting in the early 1970s, which has continued to shape the organization decades later. And not only the organization, but also the discourse of human rights and international law, because UN resolutions might begin by dictatorships and murderous regimes working together, getting an automatic majority, but then they become UN resolutions. And no one says, oh, wait a minute, the Soviet Union and Syria and Libya and Iran wrote the resolution, sponsored it. Those who voted for it were them and their other dictator allies. You just see a United Nations General Assembly resolution, people saying that's international law, whether it is or isn't, a separate question, but it has the imprimatur of international legitimacy. So let's look for a moment. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union was locked in the Cold War with the United States, and they were looking for allies to turn against the US. And the Arab world was a very easy target for this because they were in a war with Israel. America was supporting Israel. And so the Soviet Union backed the Arab states very closely and other dictatorships. So you developed an anti-Western alliance. You had countries from Africa and Asia that had left colonialism. So they were manipulated, I would say, by the Soviet Union from an anti-colonialism into an anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism. And the Soviet Union, one of the worst imperialist aggressors in history, conquered large parts of the world in Eastern Europe, but also other places around the world that they dominated. And they never got called out as the imperialists. They pretended to be the anti-imperialist, which is absurd. So the Soviet Union and the Arab states worked together. They built an automatic majority, and they passed one resolution after another condemning Israel, again with the imprimatur of the United Nations, with all of its grandeur and gravitas. And the most infamous act was the declaration in 1975 by the UN General Assembly that
Zionism is racism.
Is racism.
Which you're ruining my future question, but yes, please go on.
So, well, that's the most notorious product of that alliance. And today, if Amnesty International, one of their major campaigns on their website, and groups like Human Rights Watch and a few others, are saying that Israel is the only apartheid state in the world, because that's basically what they say, they may not be aware of it, but they're really being influenced by Soviet disinformation. Anti-Zionism was a Soviet disinformation KGB campaign, documented, run out of the KGB in the 1960s and 70s, exported to the world stage to the United Nations by that infamous resolution, but then influencing and shaping the hearts and minds of so-called human rights groups. So the impact of that alliance that you described, that axis, is very impactful on world development since then, and has, I would say, diverted the United Nations. All the time that they spend, in a given year, there might be 15 to 20 resolutions on Israel. There's one on Syria, right, one on Iran, one on North Korea, 15 on Israel, 0 on most of the others.
What would you describe as the biggest burden that lays on your shoulders right now professionally?
Look, I think there are certainly moments which are difficult. If you're at the United Nations and you see the entire room, or it feels like many people in that room are hostile. Look, for the past 18 years, I've been walking into the halls of the United Nations, and sadly, I am the most hated man at the United Nations.
Sadly, you are the most hated man in the United Nations. That's a tough badge of honor to wear.
On the one hand, it's a badge of honor because those hating me are either the murderous dictators,
right,
or they're apologists among the West, whether it's certain governments or certain NGOs, human rights groups, many of whom do amazing work, but some of whom have, as I said, a certain ideology that is anti-Western, and in some cases, among some, maybe even anti-Semitic. So I'm hated for all kinds of reasons, and yes, it's a badge of honor to be hated by those people, but it's not easy. You need to develop...
It can't be easy.
No, you need to develop a thick skin, and I am empowered by the knowledge that what I'm doing is right. And certainly the support that we do get, and you mentioned that we do get support and praise, the support that we do get from around the world, and it's a minority of people, but it's good people.
Right.
There are some radical left organizations that call themselves human rights groups, but in fact often end up empowering terrorists or dictatorship. Amnesty International, sadly, one of the great human rights organizations of the past century, has devolved into an organization that just gave a prize to Russia, second time in a year, where they issued a report that Russia is now using to justify attacking civilians in Ukraine. And Amnesty International has been condemned by many people who used to support them. Journalists, the co-founder of Amnesty Sweden, their branch in Canada.
I saw you were tweeting about it just recently. They tweeted out that they can't fight against everything or report against everything, but they had just released a 125-page report on Islamophobia and refused to do anything on anti-Semitism.
Sure.
They just released a condemnation on Ukraine for putting civilians in harm's way or something like that. Does Amnesty have any more international legitimacy?
So the thing with Amnesty is it's complex. On the one hand, there are these morally bankrupt issues where they've done things supporting terrorists. So you have all of that. On the other hand, it's an organization with millions of members around the world, dozens and dozens of branches in every major country. And it's a massive movement where there are many people doing good. And I've worked with Amnesty International activists who are doing good, who are exposing abuses in Iran and Venezuela, in Cuba and other places. So you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's not so easy to dismiss the whole movement. I think, in my opinion, in many of these cases, these people are not being courageous, and they're giving into they want to appear virtuous, sometimes called virtue signaling, want to appear virtuous, and want to appeal to people of a certain ideology. There's an ideology that called anti-colonialism. It's been prevalent in the West since the 1960s. And when they are criticizing countries in Africa or Asia or the Islamic world, they are afraid of appearing colonialist. And in their view, that's a virtue. And I'm saying you should be courageous and call the shots, balls and strikes as you see them. And certainly I am working with victims from Iran, victims from China, victims from Zimbabwe. They do not agree with their leaders who say, you in the West have your way of doing things, and we have our own human rights. The dissidents, the political prisoners that I speak to from China, from Zimbabwe, from Iran, they want universal human rights. They want the protection of universal human rights, and they want their regimes held to account. So again, coming back to your question, these things are complex. And the problem with human rights groups is who guards the guardians, who holds them to account. The harder problem is a group like Amnesty, which is quoted every single day by the New York Times, by CNN, as the voice of virtue. And that's why we're in a weird moment today where sort of many people recognize that what they did in Ukraine is absurd. And there are many more voices saying that these people need to be held to account.
So do you have hope for the future? As an Israeli, I find it hard to take the UN seriously, whereas the Europeans take it extremely seriously.
The Europeans pretend to take it seriously. They say the UN is very serious and we support the UN, but when it comes to actually protecting the institutions, they're very weak. When Saudi Arabia was running for election to the UN Women's Rights Commission, we discovered that they were elected to the Women's Rights Commission, and it was a secret ballot, but we knew that there were a number of European countries voting, and only about 7 countries voted no, but there were 12 Western EU countries on the thing. At least 5, by definition, voted yes to Saudi Arabia to be on the Women's Rights Commission. Who were those 5? Was it Belgium? Was it Norway? Was it Ireland? We asked the question. Created a scandal in Belgium. The Belgian foreign minister said, we can't answer, it's a secret ballot. But the media, there were leaks and things were coming out, and finally the prime minister shows up in parliament and he says, je regrette, I apologize, yes, we voted for Saudi Arabia to the Women's Rights Commission. But it's worse than that, Adam, because what Belgian media revealed was a telegram that went from Brussels to New York saying, said vote for Saudi Arabia and make sure to tell the Saudis that we voted for them. Meaning the Belgians, who always talk about international law and human rights, were voting for the Saudis to make sure that they knew it as a deal, because Belgium was running for the Security Council. They wanted the Saudi vote. They want Saudi oil. They want Saudi investments. So the rhetoric is that we support the UN, but in practice, their actions are helping to weaken, distort, and hijack these once great human rights institutions.
It's real. This is what the real world
is. The reality.
is.
Yeah, this is the reality.
And this is the reality, and it's not some rose-colored,
no, it's not.
It's not sugar plums. It's not candy. This is bitter coffee, no sugar, no milk.
I want people to know what their governments are doing. I want Europeans to know that we can't get a single EU country to speak out when China, Cuba, Venezuela, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia run for seats on the UN Human Rights Council or the Women's Rights Commission. I can't get them to say a word publicly. America sometimes will, and the others don't.
Is it a pointless institution? Is it now just become the playground for dictators and post-communist countries and and China and Russia to do whatever they want?
Look, the world is a difficult place. It's a dangerous place. Our democracies have to be strengthened to do the right thing. It's not always easy. Realpolitik is a difficult world to navigate, and there will be compromises along the way. It's our job to strengthen our democracies.
So when you look at what's going on in the United States right now with, I guess you could say, wokeism becoming the cool way of thinking, don't you see somewhat of like a different type of fear now going on? People are afraid to speak their mind, it seems like. You're one
Absolutely.
You're one of the few people that their job is to speak their mind.
Correct.
And that's a great privilege to be able to have that as a profession. But
I am lucky, and I appreciate it.
Right.
People in corporate America, if you work for an organization, if you say the wrong thing, we saw it. People getting canceled, people getting fired.
Right.
Dozens of examples of people who said something that was misinterpreted, and they're gone. And it's a very scary time in America. It's a very scary time in America. We're talking about pathologies. And again, let's be very clear. Everyone deserves equal rights, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their gender identity. But there has been an extremism, an extreme ideology sweeping across public opinion in America. And I think that it will affect the work that we do because, if you want to be confronting dictatorships and you're told that, words are violence.
Right.
So Salman Rushdie was stabbed and the Iranians say, well, his words are violence. And the woke revolution people, they say words are violence. Words are not violence. Getting stabbed is violence. Let's not conflate the two.
I always like to joke with you privately that you're the Abba Eban of our generation. When you walk into, the council and you're ready to give a speech, what goes through your mind before you start speaking?
When I speak, whether it's for equal treatment of Israel, whether it's against anti-Semitism, or whether it's for human rights dissidents suffering in prison in Iran, in Cuba, in Pakistan, and Venezuela, I know that I only have 90 seconds. That's usually what I get today. Maybe 2 minutes, usually only 90 seconds, and I may be cut off. And I'm trying to think, how can I use my 90 seconds in the most efficient time to get the message across? Trying to think of different audiences. There's the people in the room, many of the diplomats, they're not making the decisions. They're being made in the capitals. Some of them have hearts of stone because they're already jaded by all the speeches they hear. So sometimes I'm speaking to the diplomats, sometimes I'm speaking to wider public opinion, and I'm just trying to think, how can I get my message across in the most effective way in that time? Some people say, how do you deal with it when you have all these dictators, all this hatred, people are trying to shut you down? And I often say it's kind of like the way I imagine a surgeon who's called in and someone's been stabbed and shot. You run to the surgery room and there's blood everywhere, blood and guts. And if it were me, I would faint. I would be in shock. But the surgeon knows that he or she has a brief time to save that person and has to focus on the challenge at hand. And when I go in there, I try to blank out because sometimes physically there can be people in my face and intimidation, sort of a physical intimidation. And I'm just trying to focus on delivering my 90 seconds without getting shut down in the best way possible.
So do you think that the UN is kind of going backwards since the Trump administration's, I guess you could call it reforms towards the UN? I mean, like now, there's the refunding of UNRWA.
Yeah.
I mean, like there are a lot of reforms that were made through the Trump administration without commenting on any of their domestic politics. I mean, they did some good things at the UN.
I give them all kudos for taking on the hypocrisies.
Right.
UNRWA, as you said, as a not wilf rights, is there to perpetuate the conflict. I think it may have been justified not to fund UNRWA, but that was not a lasting reform.
Right.
The money just went right back. A lasting reform would be, what? Why don't we agree that we're going to take 1,000 people off the refugee lists? People who are living in California. There are examples brought of some famous wealthy people living abroad who are listed on the UNRWA rolls as Palestinian refugees, and they have American citizenship, they're wealthy. So maybe America would have gotten, 1,000 people off the list just to, actually change the system. That's what I would have liked to see.
What do you think is our generation's and younger's greatest moral imperative right now?
I don't think that our challenges are different than every generation has faced. In the world that I'm in, we're fighting various pathologies. We're fighting dictatorships. I think when I spoke before about amnesty, is that when our own guardians, our own guides are morally confused or morally bankrupt, I think that's a great challenge of our generation.
My final question, it's the same question I ask everybody as our final question. If I was getting ready to be a bar mitzvah and you could sum up your life experience and the greatest lessons you've learned in one sentence, even though nobody ever really gives me just one sentence, what would it be?
Adam, I think for someone who's turning bar mitzvah and then afterwards in their life, whether they're going to deal with their friends, whether they're going to deal with their teachers in school, whether they're going to deal with work colleagues, again and again, they will be confronted with great challenges. And the answer invariably is do the right thing. Do the right thing, be a mensch. In many cases, that answer is there, and we know it. And it's hard to choose it. It may not be the fun thing, it may not be the easy thing, it may not be the most convenient thing, but doing the right thing is always the right answer.
I want to thank my very good friend and special guest, Hillel Neuer, for letting me bounce around with him for the last hour and a half. I want to thank the Bravdo Winery for this beautiful bottle of wine. If you like the wine that we're drinking, you can find it at wineonthevine.com. And if you want to plant a vine at the Bravdo Winery, you can do it at wineonthevine.org. If you're drinking your Israeli wine, drink it with someone you love. L'chaim.